The Red Truck of Christmas, read by the author Kim Michael. For as long as I can remember, I've heard stories about the red truck. My dad first told me when I was a kid, just like his dad told him and probably his dad before him. Folk tales like the mystery of the red truck seem to live on forever in small towns like ours. As if surrounded by corn and beans and wheat fields somehow blurs the line between the past, the present, and the future. And not just for my family. At some point, everyone in these parts has heard the stories about the red truck, as well as the mystery that surrounds it. They've been passed down from one generation to the next like family heirlooms. I can still see my grandpa, sitting in his rocking chair next to the fireplace, his face glowing in the firelight, eyes wide as he tells me about the ghostly pickup truck, blazing red, appearing on some distant back road, only on Christmas Eve night. His eyes would grow even wider as he leaned in to whisper, "No one knows where it comes from, and no one knows where it goes. It just appears, and then poof, it's gone. And as God is my witness, anyone who's ever seen it can't remember seeing a driver. Only a shadow behind the wheel, a ghost maybe, or even an angel." He would lean back in his chair silent for a moment, and I, sitting on the floor in front of him, listened with eyes as big as saucers. "Things happen around here on Christmas Eve that don't happen any other time of the year, and no one knows how or why," he'd say finally. "Folks on the verge of losing their home suddenly find money in a box on their front porch. Medicine badly needed by a family with a sick child suddenly finds it on their front doorstep. Toys for the little ones whose families are too poor to afford gifts. Boxes of food and clothing, even Christmas trees. Whenever something unexplained happens on Christmas Eve, everyone knows the red truck of Christmas has been there." Now, over the years, there have been many rumors about who or what the red truck really is. Some thought it was a ghost. Others just a wistful exaggeration of people wanting it to be more than just a collective figment of people's imagination. For me, I guess I thought there had to be some rational explanation, but being the consummate cynic, I never really gave it much credence. Now, there was one story I remember about a man named Edwin Sykes who lived back in the late 1930s in that big old house over on Elm Street. He didn't always live there. In fact, he grew up poor in a little shanty on the other side of town, the kind of poor that leaves lasting scars and wounds of the soul that never heal. His only interest, in fact his only purpose in living, was money and power, and he'd do anything to get them. Blinded by arrogance, he turned on the few friends and neighbors he had during the Great Depression, buying up their houses for pennies on the dollar and putting them out on the street. But like so many stories of good and evil, the story of Edwin Sykes is a cautionary tale, ending in tragedy for him and his entire family. And for some reason, I had always thought that the legend of the red truck was somehow connected to him, but I don't know how or why. Now, I have to tell you this. Growing up with these stories gave me a real appreciation for the red truck. Not that I really believed in it, but like so many, I like a good mystery. It's fun to think there might be something out there that's unexplainable, a dinosaur swimming in a lake somewhere in the world, or a 9-foot-tall man-like creature roaming the mountains of the Northwest. But best of all is a ghost story in your own backyard. Seriously, though, as much as I would have liked to believe in the red truck legend, I remained an unbeliever. Even so, I was fascinated, maybe even a little jealous of those who did. but call it fate or destiny. It's interesting how certain things can happen in life, and suddenly everything changes, as if part of some grand invisible plan that can only be seen when distanced by time. Mark Twain once said the two most important days of your life are the day you were born and the day you realize why you were born. For me, the why of my life changed dramatically because of two people I met when I was just a kid. Old man Ben Milner and his wife Ida lived in our community for longer than anyone could remember. His farm was about a mile down on the same gravel road where I grew up, and I passed by their house almost every day riding my bike to school. It was a tall, majestic white 3-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch and an even larger white gray shingled barn in the back. On one side of the barn stood an old farm windmill, grinding in the wind, pumping water for the livestock. I thought it was one of the most beautiful homes I had ever seen, and one day, riding by on my bike, I stopped to look at it. I didn't see old Ben at first, but he saw me at the end of his drive. I was about 11 then, young enough to still be afraid of people I didn't know. Down on one knee doing something in his yard, he looked up, paused a minute, and then motioned for me to come closer. I got off my bike and pushed it part way up the gravel drive and stopped several yards away. I had seen old Ben and his wife around the farm for years, but I really didn't know them. He smiled slightly. "You're the kid from down the road." "Yes, sir," I said timidly. "I like your house." I felt like I needed to give him some explanation why I was just standing there at the end of his drive. He smiled, and I think that was the first time I had ever seen him really smile. "Mrs. Milner just took some cookies out of the oven. You want one?" I looked down at my bike. Of course I wanted one. I'm a kid. But I resisted trying to look too eager. Still, I could already smell the aroma of those amazing, freshly baked cookies calling my name from inside the house. "Yeah, I guess." I tried to say as nonchalantly as possible, but he knew. "Wait here," he said, standing up and then disappearing into the house. A couple minutes later, he emerged with not just one, but 2 chocolate chip cookies wrapped in a napkin, still warm from the oven, and a petite, gray-haired little lady following him. I knew she had to be Ida Milner, a gentle, kind-hearted soul whose face seemed to light up with her smile. And for me, it was love at first sight. So that is how I met old Ben Milner and his wife. And over the years, I stopped there often. I had no grandparents of my own, and innocently, one day I asked Mrs. Milner if she would be my grandma, 'cause I didn't have one. And suddenly she began to cry. At first I thought I had done something wrong until she reached out, pulled me close, and hugged me, tears still in her eyes. From that day on, she was my Grandma Milner. And over the years, they both became the grandparents I never had. I tell you all of this because old Ben was an adamant believer in the red truck. And through the years, I grew up listening to his stories, which were strangely different than the ones my dad and Grandpa used to tell me. Like he knew something about the red truck that no one else did. He knew I really didn't believe in it. And he seemed to take delight in telling me about the latest sightings, how one year someone saw it in one of the counties to the north, and then the next year maybe a county to the south. Even if I didn't believe in it, there was something about the sightings that haunted me. Like they weren't really random. Like they were dots out there that could be connected, but no one ever had. Old Ben gave me the answer one day in a way so offhanded that I almost missed it. In a moment of seriousness, he glanced at me and said, "Nothing in this world is random, not even when or where the red truck shows up." Yet for all the sightings, for all the proof, for all the people who fervently believed in the red truck of Christmas, I still did not. I was becoming the unrelenting cynic. But really, in my defense, how could I not? It wasn't like I'd seen it for myself. But again, call it fate or destiny, that was about to change as well. It was Christmas 1972. I came home from college for Christmas break that year when, driving on an old gravel back road on the way to a friend's house, I had a flat tire. It was Christmas Eve, and though there was a little snow on the ground, it was warm enough that a blanket of fog had set in. I pulled over on the grassy shoulder and got out to change the tire. Just as I took off the lug nut, I looked up, and there, bursting out of the fog, I saw it. The red truck. So close I could almost touch it. A Christmas tree on its side in the back, brightly wrapped gifts tethered beneath it. It passed by so quickly I caught my breath as it passed, and less than a heartbeat later, it was gone. I slowly stood up, dazed, just staring at the wall of fog where I saw it melt into the mist. And in those few seconds, I had become a believer. Chapter 2. Years passed as years do. I graduated college, and my trips home became fewer and fewer. I stayed in the town where I went to college, trying to decide what next to do with my life, not really sure of anything. And in all that time, the sightings of the red truck continued. Even several hundred miles away, I heard the stories, and I realized it was quickly becoming an urban legend. But little did I know that the legend and destiny were already working overtime on my behalf. Everything changed sadly with a note from Ben that Mrs. Milner, my adopted grandmother, had passed away. I went home the very next day. I stayed with old Ben until after the funeral, and then some. She was the love of his life, and they had grown old together, tired and frail and now alone. I knew Ben didn't have much time left. I decided to stay as long as he needed me. Nearly 4 weeks to the day, he passed away in his sleep, and I believe with all my heart, I felt her presence in the house that night. She had come to take him home. After the funeral, I packed my bag, ready to leave when there came a knock at the door. Thomas Merritt, the local attorney, smiled at me through the old screen door. "You have a few minutes?" "Sure, Tom. What's up?" I said. Now, I'd known Tom for a long time. He wasn't as old as my parents, but not by much. I invited him in, and we sat at the old Formica table in Ben's kitchen. "This is Ben and Ida's last will and testament," he said, pulling out a large white envelope. "So what does this have to do with me?" I asked. "You don't know?" he said, as if I should. "They left everything to you, the house, the vehicles, the farm equipment, 523 acres of farmland, and just a little over $100,000 in the bank." I was stunned. "You're kidding." "I'm surprised you didn't know. Usually people know when they're the beneficiaries of a will." I shook my head. "They never said a word, Tom." "What am I going to do with a 500-acre farm? I don't know anything about farming." "You don't have to." In the last years of his life, Ben partnered with several of the local farmers around here. They do the farming, foot the bills, and split the profits at the end of the year. You won't have to do anything but pay the taxes. The farm is self-sustaining and will pay you a reasonable income for many years to come. Tom paused, then cautiously glanced up at me. There's something else. The way Tom said it struck me as odd, as if it was something he was unsure about telling me. "Have you ever looked inside the barn?" Now, I had been in the barn many times. But Ben always wanted me to stay out of the main part where all the equipment was stored. He was afraid I could get hurt, and I never really had any desire to venture in anyway. So if there was something there that he didn't want me to see, I wouldn't have seen it. Tom smiled slightly. Maybe we need to go out and take a look. He stood up and I followed him to the barn. He opened the small side door and led me through the corridor lined with the livestock stalls and into the main open area. I looked up at the open loft where the hay was stored, and I had no idea that the roof was up that high. So what am I supposed to be looking at, Tom? He went over to a large tarp spread out over what I thought was a stack of hay. As he peeled it back, my jaw dropped. The red truck, I whispered underneath my breath. I looked at Tom. Ben? He smiled. Yes, at least in part. I don't understand. Tom leaned on the hood as he turned to me. Let me tell you a story, and it's one that must stay with you and you alone. Have you ever heard the name Edwin Sykes? Only from the stories I've heard, I said. The man who got rich during the Great Depression, buying up everyone's homes for little or nothing and then putting them out on the street. People around here still refer to him as the devil incarnate, and to them he was. I guess some wounds never heal. Tom glanced at the red truck and then back at me. The story of Edwin Sykes is a sad one. Edwin was genuinely evil. The kind of evil that never can be reclaimed, blind to all except what he wanted to see. To him, money was power, and throughout the Great Depression, he continued his rampage, buying up his neighbor's property, destroying lives, and becoming extraordinarily wealthy in the process. But despite all of his wealth, his soul grew more and more bankrupt, devoid of any good that might have saved him from himself. The evil that filled his life eventually destroyed him, but not before destroying the lives of all those around him. When the Great Depression ended, his wife had finally had enough. She could no longer put up with him or what he had become. She left in the middle of the night, never to return. Now, Edwin had 3 sons. All of them went to war against Hitler in Germany, and it was rumored that all 3 were killed in action. Edwin went to his grave thinking they were all dead, but his youngest son, Eric, had actually survived. Badly wounded during the Battle of the Bulge, he spent a year in a hospital in northern Italy before word could reach his family that he had survived. And if there is a miracle to this story, it is this. Eric's life had been saved by 3 soldiers who carried him off of the battlefield, and all 3 lost their lives in saving his. It's hard to imagine what could change a person so completely. But that's exactly what happened. Before that fateful day on the battlefield, Eric Sykes was well on his way to becoming his father. But for the selfless act of 3 soldiers he didn't even know. Until that moment, he didn't know the meaning of compassion or sacrifice or even kindness. It was as if the veil had been lifted. The life of lies and cruelty he was destined to live suddenly vanished. And for the first time, he saw himself as others saw him. And more importantly, he saw how others saw his father. Standing at the grave sites of those soldiers who saved his life, he swore to become worthy of their sacrifice. He knew he could not change the past, but he could change the present, and more importantly, he could change the future. He pledged to undo all the evil that his father had done and replace it with good. The red truck, I whispered. Tom nodded. Eric searched for months to find a way to make right all that his father had done, and it was more difficult than you might think. He knew the people of this community were hard-working, honest people with too much pride to take charity, even if it was to right a wrong committed by his father. He decided to take the one night of the year when gifts could be given anonymously. And by fate, he stumbled on a red truck that his father had bought but never used. It was perfect. He could do his work without anyone being the wiser. That is how the red truck of Christmas began. Tom glanced at me for a moment, maybe trying to read my expression before sharing what he knew would be the real bombshell. Eric Sykes was Ben Milner's father. His father? Ben's real last name is Sykes, I said in disbelief. Tom nodded. Ben and his father knew the Sykes name was unrecoverable in this community, synonymous with all that was evil and bad. To live here and secretly carry on the legacy of the red truck, Ben could not risk anyone ever finding out the Sykes family was behind it. To make sure that never happened, Ben Sykes took his mother's family name, Milner. When Eric passed away, Ben and Ida Milner moved to a farm just outside of town, and no one ever suspected that he had anything to do with the red truck or that his real family name was Sykes. But why me? What does any of this have to do with me, Tom? Tom smiled as if again I should already know. They loved you. They had always planned to have children, but sadly it was not to be. There was no one to leave the farm to, and more importantly, there was no one to carry on the secret of the red truck. That is, until one day Ben met a young boy at the end of his driveway. Me, I said. Tom smiled at me but said nothing. So Ben was really behind the red truck. At that moment I heard something stir outside the barn. Tom glanced over at the huge barn doors. Not exactly. He went over, unlatched the massive doors, and pushed them open. Outside stood a group of people. I recognized them all. Mr. Jansen, who owned the local grocery store. Louis Hartman, the bank president. Joel Bittner, owner of the pharmacy. Old Mrs. Bonk, who owned the local Five and Dime. Phillips Taylor, the only doctor in town. Roy Richardson, who owned the local insurance company. Arlene Tyndall, who owned the local newspaper. And Bill Williams, the postmaster. They were all there. Tom glanced at them and then back at me. These people are the real red truck. They all came together when it was discovered what the red truck really was, and they had a very good reason for keeping the secret going. Each is a descendant of the original families that Edwin Sykes swindled out of their homes. They were the first to be helped by Eric and the red truck of Christmas. When the fortune Edwin Sykes had built was finally gone, it was their money and their desire to keep it going that made it all possible. So now, they in turn continue to pay it forward. Each person you see here has a unique knowledge of the people in our community. And there is always one in this small group who knows when someone needs help. That's how over the years the red truck knew where to go and who to help. Because of them, the legend of the red truck grew and continued to be passed down through the generations. And outside of this small group, no one ever knew. Tom turned back at me. Ben passed before he could share all of this with you, before he could ask you for a particular favor that he was a little too timid to ask. I glanced at the red truck. He wanted me to. It's not a requirement, mind you, Tom said. You will inherit everything regardless. But Ben believed that you would be the one to carry on what he and so many others had faithfully put in motion so many years ago, and maybe even one day pass it on to your kids. Chapter 3. In retrospect, it's funny how life can change on a dime. unexpectedly, without warning. I had no plans to return to the little town where I grew up, certainly not as a farmer, but that is exactly what happened. I fell in love with and married my high school sweetheart, and we took up residence in the old Milner house, sort of our own little It's a Wonderful Life story, I guess you could say. By the spring of the following year, we had our first child, Michael, who showed up kicking and crying, but we loved him anyway. And by Christmas the following year, we had a beautiful, bouncing little girl named Maddie. But what about the red truck, you ask? Well, for all those years after moving back to old Ben's house, the sightings of the red truck never stopped. And to this day, no one knows if the stories are true or if the red truck really exists. And what about the question of, did I honor old Ben's last wish? No one will ever really know that either. All I can tell you is, it's Christmas Eve, and I have deliveries to make.
Come and take my hand, walk with me this day among your fellow man. I heard the angels say, he led me down the lonely streets where the poor and ragged go. In the distance a church bell rang, and it began to snow. And oh, the night, the wind blew cold and lonely. Beneath the fading light, he turned and said to me, unto the least of these, only heaven sees, broken angels bound for glory, longing to be free. Unto the least of these, brothers all are we. If every sparrow's counted, and no kindness goes unseen, maybe that's what love in heaven means. When you do it for the least of these. So we journeyed on, and the sky grew soft and clear. I looked up in that silent night and saw a star appear. He said it wasn't a mighty king with battle flags unfurled, just a homeless boy born on Christmas Day would one day change the world. And oh, the nights, miracles surround me, angels taking flight, singing peace on earth above me. To the least of these, only heaven sees, broken angels bound for glory, longing to be free. And to the least of these, brothers all are we. If every sparrow's counted, and no kindness goes unseen. Maybe that's what love in heaven means. If every sparrow's counted and no kindness goes unseen, maybe that's what love in heaven means. When you do it for the least of these.
The Red Truck of Christmas is an independent production, written and produced by Kim Michael. All rights reserved. Copyright October 2022. Hi, this is Kim Michael. I hope you've enjoyed this production of The Red Truck of Christmas. Visit me at my website, kim-michael-author.com. I entitled it In Search of Wonder. There you will find my books, my short stories, my videos, and of course my award-winning music featuring the In Search of Wonder Digital Orchestra. And so until then, I wish you much peace and a very, very Merry Christmas.